Imagine an empire that once swallowed the oceans, an empire where the sun never set, suddenly hesitating, not because of war, not because of hunger, but because of a quiet, calculated warning whispered across the Atlantic. A young nation, still smelling of civil war and unfinished ambition, looked straight at the British Empire and said, "Enough." In that moment, history shifted, and almost no one remembers why. By the late 19th century, power was still measured in steel hulls and red-stained maps. United States, officially a republic, unofficially restless, began playing a far more dangerous game. Not conquest by cannon, but domination by declaration. A line was drawn across the Western Hemisphere. Invisible, arrogant, absolute. And Europe was told it no longer belonged there. Across the table sat the British Empire, wealthy, seasoned, accustomed to obedience. London had ruled seas, dictated trade, and decided the fates of continents without asking permission. But empires age. And aging empires often miss the moment when the rules change. Between them stood Venezuela, indebted, unstable, rich in promise, and poor in power. Officially, this was a story about protecting a vulnerable nation. That was the public script, the moral justification, the clean headline. But pause for a second. Ask yourself who truly benefited. Was this compassion or rehearsal? The first time America tested whether it could push an old empire back without firing a shot. Because from that moment on, the Western Hemisphere stopped being a collection of nations and became a stage. And the world learned something unsettling. The most dangerous empires don't arrive with armies. They arrive with principles. To understand why this moment mattered, you have to step into the late 19th century and feel the imbalance of the world. On one side stood the British Empire. Not merely a country, but a system. Its navy ruled the sea lanes like a tax collector with cannons. Its banks decided which nations breathed easily and which choked on debt. From London's counting houses, fortunes were extracted from India, Africa, the Caribbean, and quietly recycled into more ships, more influence, more control. This was power, perfected through habit. The world was used to Britain winning. On the other side was the United States, a nation still arguing with itself about what it wanted to be. Barely a generation removed from civil war, America was rich in land, poor in experience, and dangerously confident. It had no global empire, no ancient navy traditions, no colonial bureaucracy spanning continents. What it did have was something newer and far less visible. An obsession with the future. And a fear that the past, European empires, would never let it arrive. Latin America sat between these two forces like a vault left unlocked. Former Spanish colonies staggered under debt, political chaos, and foreign loans designed to fail. British merchants financed railways, ports, and governments, not out of charity, but because debt was leverage, influence without occupation, control without flags. For London, South America was not a battlefield. It was a balance sheet. For Washington, it was something else entirely. The Western Hemisphere was supposed to be different. That belief had been written decades earlier, not as law, but as warning. A declaration that Europe should stay out. At the time, no one took it seriously. America was too small, too fractured, too weak to enforce such arrogance, but history has a habit of letting ideas grow teeth. By the 1890s, American factories roared, steel poured, and ambition expanded faster than borders ever could. The United States did not yet know how to rule an empire, but it knew how to resent one. British influence in the Americas began to look less like commerce and more like a threat. Not to Venezuela, to America's future. And this is where the tension quietly sharpened. Because when a rising power meets a declining giant, conflict does not begin with gunfire. It begins with denial. Britain assumed its position was permanent. America assumed it was temporary. And somewhere between those assumptions, the stage was set for a confrontation that would redefine who controlled the hemisphere, who merely watched it slip away. The spark did not come from Washington or London. It came from a stretch of jungle most people in Europe could not find on a map. The Essequibo region, dense, remote, and quietly valuable, sat between British Guiana and Venezuela like an unanswered question. For decades, Britain treated it as already answered. British maps claimed it. British companies moved in. British power assumed silence meant consent. Venezuela disagreed, weak, indebted, politically unstable, but not blind. Caracas protested, appealed, pleaded. No one listened. Not because Britain was cruel, but because Britain was accustomed to being obeyed. And then something unprecedented happened. In 1895, the United States stepped forward, not as a mediator, but as a challenger. Washington announced that the border dispute between Britain and Venezuela was no longer a regional matter. It was now an American concern, a matter of principle, a matter of hemispheric order. This was the taboo, the line that was never supposed to be crossed. For the first time, the United States claimed the authority to judge a dispute between a European empire and a Latin American state, and demanded that the British Empire submit to international arbitration. Not suggested. Demanded. The language was polite, the meaning was not. London was stunned. Britain had negotiated borders with rifles, fleets, and treaties signed under pressure. It didn't answer to former colonies, especially not one that still insisted it was merely a republic, not an empire. But Washington did not back down. It doubled down. Officials spoke of doctrine, of destiny, of the Western Hemisphere as a closed system. If Britain refused, the implication was clear. Escalation would follow. Not immediately, not loudly, but inevitably. At the center of it all stood Venezuela, suddenly elevated from debtor state to geopolitical flashpoint. Overnight, Venezuela became useful, not because it was powerful, but because it was positioned perfectly. This was not a war declaration. It was something far more dangerous. A rising power, announcing that it would decide the rules from now on. Britain had assumed influence was permanent. America had just proven it was conditional. And with that single intervention, a quiet assumption shattered. Europe no longer owned the Americas. What followed was not war, but something colder, a prolonged stare across the chessboard of power. Diplomats replaced generals, maps replaced rifles, and money, as always, whispered louder than morality. In Washington, wooden tables were covered with hand-drawn borders and shipping routes. The disputed line in Venezuela was no longer jungle and rivers. It was a test case. Every mile Britain claimed was interpreted as a mile taken from America's future authority. The United States framed its argument carefully, almost theatrically. This was not aggression, they said. This was defense. Defense of order. Defense of a hemisphere that Europe had grown too comfortable exploiting. London heard something very different. In the halls of the Thyme, enfin, riser irritation mixed with disbelief. Britain had dealt with rebellions, revolutions, and rival empires, but this was new. A former colony lecturing the world's largest empire on acceptable behavior. British officials dismissed the Americans as emotional, inexperienced, and dangerously idealistic. Privately, however, they noticed something unsettling. The Americans were serious. Behind closed doors, British analysts calculated costs. Not just military ones, political, financial, reputational. Britain could win a naval confrontation. That was never in doubt. The Royal Navy still outmatched anything America could deploy. But winning the sea was not the same as winning the future. A war with the United States would fracture trade, destabilize markets, and push other European powers into uncomfortable positions. Germany watched closely. France waited quietly. Everyone sensed that a precedent was forming. Meanwhile, Washington applied pressure without pulling the trigger. Speeches invoked destiny. Editorials framed the dispute as a moral crusade. The language of doctrine was repeated until it sounded like natural law. Europe, they said, had no right to redraw borders in the Americas. Not anymore. The statement was radical, precisely because it was spoken calmly. And then there was money. British capital was everywhere in Latin America. Railroads, ports, loans, banks. The empire did not need flags when it had contracts, but contracts depended on stability, and stability depended on legitimacy. If the United States succeeded in presenting itself as the final arbiter of hemispheric disputes, British investments would no longer be protected by inevitability. They would be protected or threatened by American approval. This realization slowed London's hand. The tension rose in waves. One week, British newspapers mocked American arrogance. The next, American diplomats hinted at mobilization. Maps were redrawn, letters hardened, and always, just beneath the surface, hovered the unspoken truth. If Britain refused arbitration, it would be admitting that force was its only argument. And force, for the first time in a century, carried unacceptable risks. At the center of the storm sat Venezuela, largely silent. Its leaders understood their role. This was no longer about their borders. It was about whether a new power could enforce an old idea, whether the hemisphere belonged to history or to whoever was bold enough to claim it. As weeks stretched into months, something remarkable happened. Britain began to negotiate the idea of compromise. Not retreat, never that word, but adjustment. Arbitration was discussed seriously. The unthinkable was now plausible. This was the rising tension that history textbooks flatten into a footnote. No battles, no heroes, just a slow realization spreading through the corridors of empire. The rules had changed, and pretending otherwise would be more dangerous than accepting it. By the time London prepared its response, the outcome was no longer just about Venezuela. It was about whether the British Empire would confront a rising challenger or quietly acknowledge that the Western Hemisphere was slipping beyond its grasp. The climax did not arrive with cannon fire. It arrived with a decision, quiet, bureaucratic, devastating in its restraint. In early 1896, the British Empire agreed to arbitration. No parade, no declaration of defeat, just a measured acceptance that the dispute over Venezuela's border would be handed to an international tribunal. On paper, it looked civilized, reasonable, even noble. But every man in London's Foreign Office understood what had just happened. An empire that had ruled by assumption had just acknowledged a limit. For decades, Britain had drawn borders where its power reached and ignored protests from those too weak to resist. Now, for the first time in the Western Hemisphere, it accepted that another nation had the authority to say stop. The silence that followed was heavier than any naval engagement, because silence meant consent. Across the Atlantic, Washington said little. There was no triumphalism, no celebration. The United States had learned something essential. Real power does not need to announce itself. It only needs to be obeyed. By forcing Britain to arbitration, America proved it could shape outcomes without firing a shot. And that was far more dangerous than victory through war. The decision sent ripples far beyond Venezuela. Diplomats across Europe took note. If Britain could be compelled to yield here, it could be challenged elsewhere. Not today, not tomorrow, but eventually. The precedent was set, and precedents are the most contagious form of power. Britain told itself this was pragmatic. a strategic choice, avoiding unnecessary conflict, and all of that was true. But it was also an admission that the Western Hemisphere was no longer a place where European empires acted without consequence. For Venezuela, the outcome was symbolic, more than transformative. Its borders would still be debated, its politics still fragile, its debts still suffocating. Protection came with strings, and those strings now led north. This was the moment the old empire blinked. Not because it was weak, but because it recognized something colder than force, a rival willing to wait, willing to escalate quietly, and willing to rewrite the rules while everyone else was still arguing over the old ones. No shots were fired. Yet something irreversible had happened. Power had changed hands. Not loudly, but permanently. What followed did not look like conquest. That was the genius of it. After the arbitration, there were no occupying armies, no new flags raised over Venezuelan soil. Instead, influence seeped in quietly, like ink, spreading through water. The United States did not replace Britain overnight. It inherited the position Britain had just proven was negotiable. This was not empire by annexation. This was empire by permission. The mechanism was simple, repeatable, and devastatingly effective. First came moral authority, the claim that America alone could keep Europe out. Then came arbitration, diplomacy, and the language of stability. Finally came leverage, loans, investments, trade access, and political recognition. Each step appeared reasonable. Together, they were irreversible. For nations like Venezuela, protection carried a price. European gunboats were kept away, yes. But in exchange, Washington became the final referee. Disputes, debts, leadership crises, even internal conflicts increasingly passed through American approval. Sovereignty was not taken. It was managed. This was the quiet birth of a system, one where the Western Hemisphere was no longer contested territory, but a controlled environment. The British Empire still traded, still invested, still existed, but it no longer set the terms. Influence without enforcement is temporary. America understood that. Britain learned it too late. Over time, this model spread. Financial oversight replaced military occupation. Political pressure replaced colonial administrators. When instability arose, it was framed as a threat to order. And order required intervention. Not conquest. Intervention. The word mattered. The long-term consequence was subtle but profound. Latin America did not become free from external power. It simply exchanged one center of gravity for another. The difference was narrative. European empires ruled openly. America ruled while insisting it was not ruling at all. And that illusion endured because it worked. By the early 20th century, the pattern was clear. When Europe looked west, it hesitated. When America spoke, it expected compliance. The arbitration over Venezuela had not solved a border dispute. It had demonstrated a formula, a way to dominate without appearing to dominate, to conquer without marching. This was the falling action history rarely emphasizes. No dramatic collapse, no formal declaration, just a gradual tightening of influence, until the idea of European power in the Americas felt outdated, even inappropriate. The shift was complete long before most people realized it had happened. And once power moves quietly, it almost never moves back. The catastrophe was not destruction. It was normalization. After Venezuela, nothing looked the same. Yet everything pretended to be. European empires did not vanish from the Americas in flames. They faded in relevance. Their gunboats stopped coming. Their ultimatums softened. Their confidence eroded. And in their place stood a new assumption, rarely questioned, that the Western Hemisphere had a guardian, This was the lesson history buried under polite language. Power does not always conquer by force. Sometimes it conquers by convincing everyone else that resistance is unnecessary, that intervention is protection, that dominance is stability. From that moment on, crises in the Americas followed a familiar pattern. Debt became a security issue. Political instability became a justification. Sovereignty became conditional. Each intervention was framed as an exception. Taken together, they formed a system. And systems outlive intentions. The tragedy is not that one empire replaced another. The tragedy is that the method proved so effective, it became invisible. People stopped asking who decided. They only asked whether order would be restored. Now pause, and look at it. Then look at that. Once again, powerful nations speak the language of protection. Once again, borders become secondary to influence. Once again, intervention is sold as necessity, not ambition. The vocabulary has changed. The logic has not. This is why the story of Venezuela in the 19th century matters. Not because it was unique, but because it was the prototype. The moment when a rising power learned it could rewrite the rules quietly. And a declining empire learned that tradition offers no immunity. History does not repeat itself loudly. It repeats itself efficiently. The names change, the justifications evolve, but the mechanism remains intact. So the question is not whether empires still exist. They do. The question is whether we recognize them while they are being built, or only after the silence sets in and resistance feels unreasonable. Because the most dangerous moment in history is not when shots are fired. It is when no one feels the need to fire them anymore.